Okay, perfect. All right, well, welcome everyone to the American Elm and Dutch Elm Disease Zoom class today. So, this is going to be part of a series that we're doing where we're talking about different native tree species, of which either some kind of pest or disease, unfortunately, is plaguing populations of these trees and really putting them in peril. And so today we're focusing on American elm. Next month, we're going to talk about eastern hemlock and the woolly adelgid, which is a type of insect, if you all aren't familiar with the woolly adelgid. And then we're going to go into September, which is going to be a big one, where we're talking about American chestnut and how they were unfortunately annihilated by chestnut blight. And then what are some breeding programs and kind of initiatives being taken to try to restore it back into our native woodlands. So that's kind of our schedule, our time frame of upcoming classes we have going on. So just to start off with, I always like to talk about the tree first. What are its common characteristics? Then we'll get into some of its economic and ecological importance. Then we'll get into the disease itself and where we're seeing this disease in the US. So, just to start out with, let's talk about American elm, which is Ulmus americana. It's in the Ulmaceae family, the elm family. So, in particular, we have several native elm species. Today, we are going to be talking about American elm, but with that said, the disease we're going to discuss can affect other elm species, not just American. But when it comes to the native range of American elm, pretty much it was found all across the eastern half of North America. So pretty much anything east of the Mississippi, you were going to be seeing American elm in our woodlands. Primarily, you're going to see elm along stream banks and more moist ground. But surprisingly, as elm trees just became used in more ornamental purposes, they're really found to be pretty adaptable trees. So they can tolerate both dry and moist sites as long as the soil is relatively well draining. The pH they like kind of towards a neutral zone, but for the most part, these can do pretty well kind of in a more suburban climate too. Generally, this is a medium tree, gets 60 to 80 feet tall. There are specimens where that could reach over 100 feet tall. The shape is interesting. It really varies depending on where the tree is located, whether it has more of an open area versus if it's kind of competing with other trees in the woods. But generally, its overall habit is more of this vase shape with a broad rounded crown. Now, the leaves, the nice thing with elm leaves is they're pretty easy to identify. It's an alternate leaf arrangement with leaves that have kind of this double serration. So that double serration is along the edges, along the margins, and you can just kind of see with this close up of the smaller picture, it just looks at like it has a bunch of little pointed teeth on the edges. And then if you look on the underside of the leaf, it is a little bit hairy to the touch. It has a little bit of pubescence. And overall, whenever you're kind of touching the leaf, it's very scratchy, very rough textured. And a lot of times when you're looking at it, the base of the leaf itself is pretty asymmetrical. Now, with elms, we would put them with their foliage as kind of more of a yellow fog color, but it's pretty minuscule. You're not really growing elms because of their spectacular fall color. It's not very spectacular, but the leaves do tend to change into more of a yellow coloration in the fall. So some more characteristics about it. Generally, the bark, as it matures, as it ages, becomes a dark gray color, and it gets these flat braided ridges on it. The flowers, they're pretty nondescript too, pretty inconspicuous. They're kind of this greenish burgundy color that appear late winter into early spring. Generally, these flowers are occurring prior to the leaves emerging. And in their place, after they have been fertilized, you can kind of see with the picture here. You get the development of the single-seeded samaras, which are the tiny seeds that are flattened, kind of like a pancake, and have this papery wing to them. So those usually start to appear later on, usually later into spring is when you start to see these. So when it comes to importance of American elm, let's start off from an economic perspective. Generally, elm is used in the lumber industry for lumber, firewood, pulpwood. So it does serve its purpose there. Now, kind of more recently, before the Dutch elm disease that we're going to talk about really just kind of annihilated quite a bit of the population. Before, it was really growing traction, of course, as an ornamental, as a great shade tree that was planted more and more, kind of in a similar way what we think of whenever ash trees were grown more as shade trees too, and just kind of more beloved into kind of more suburban urban settings. But unfortunately, since the disease has occurred, we really can't recommend American elm much as an ornamental just because you don't want to risk planting it and then it succumbing to the disease later on. So it really doesn't have that purpose necessarily anymore. But we'll kind of talk more about, what are some proactive measures with the disease? Can you prevent the disease? Are there new breeding programs to help build more resistant American elm trees? So we'll get it all into that here in a minute. Now, from an ecological standpoint, as you probably kind of figured from some of the other trees that we talked about, they support a wide range of Lepidopteran species. So your moths and butterflies, they're serving as the larval host plant for quite a few different types of caterpillar species. So anywhere from our painted lady, which is kind of up there, you can see in the first picture, to our very similar looking ones, our Eastern comma and our question mark butterflies, our mourning cloaks, and then our red spotted purple, which is the last picture that you can see here. So it does support a diversity of butterflies. Now, there are certain species that may prefer it as a host plant to others, but these are all species that we may actually see the caterpillar on. Now, aside from that, the seeds that it produces, those samaras, those are eaten by a wide range of songbirds and small mammals. So it serves as a good food source for them. And in addition to, of course, this is a tree. So we're talking about providing some sort of shelter or nesting site as well for different bird populations. So with that said, this is, you know, a very important tree that's found here in the eastern half of the United States. And so what's happened to it? Because we don't see very many elms. If we do, they may be unfortunately in a weak state, or we're seeing different elm species instead. What's happened to them? So let's kind of talk a little bit more in depth on this disease. So we're talking about Dutch elm disease. And Dutch elm disease, to give you kind of a broad summary, which we'll dive more into here in a minute, it's a fatal fungal disease, so it's spread by a fungus. It's caused by a fungus that spread through bark beetles that are feeding on the tree, and they attack the tissue of the tree, and this results in wilting, defoliation, and ultimately death, unfortunately. The American elm, slippery elm, and rock elm can all be affected. I know we have quite a bit of slippery elm in our woodlands around here, so unfortunately, it could be impacted by Dutch elm disease. Currently, we don't have a cure. Again, we'll talk about some management methods here at the very end. But there are different breeding programs and trying to get different cultivars to have some resistance. So there's one called Princeton that has some resistance to the disease. There's another one called Valley Forge, which is not far from where I'm originally from, that also has some immunity, but not complete immunity. And what you'll find is, because there are elms found across the world, there are Asiatic elms that actually have higher resistance levels to this disease, which is actually very similar to chestnut, where with the American chestnut that we'll talk about, the American chestnut is prone to chestnut blight, but then the Chinese chestnut is not quite as prone to it. So it's kind of the same here with the elms. American elms prone to it, but the Asiatic elms have a little bit higher resistance. And so what you'll end up finding is a lot of these breeding programs may consist of breeding Asiatic species with the native species to try to get some of that resistance. So, I mean, in that standpoint, it's not necessarily, unfortunately, like the true native, but, you know, scientists and botanists are trying to do what they can to just save the tree as a whole. Okay, so how do we know, especially if we have elms, what are some of the symptoms that we see on this? So let's talk about some of the symptoms. Then we'll get into the fungus specifically. Then we'll get into the bark beetles and kind of go from there, because there's multiple components to this disease. So typically with Dutch elm disease, we start to see symptoms appearing late spring into early summer, although you can see symptoms pretty much throughout the whole growing season. Typically in the crown, you're going to start to see branches start to turn yellow, wilt, and then brown. And oftentimes that can progress down that whole branch, and that whole branch can die, and then it can impact the trunk and then unfortunately the rest of the tree. Now, as to how long will it take the tree to die, or could it live several years? It just honestly depends. As we talk about the fungal disease, kind of where the fungus ends up in part of the tree is going to determine how fast it's probably going to decline. Um, if it's kind of starting in the branches first and then kind of making its way towards the rest of the tree, the rest of the parts of the tree, it may last several years, but then we'll find if it gets into the root system of the tree, it may fail sooner. So it just kind of depends. Now, also something that you may notice, like when you see this dieback, and if you look at the branches that were infected, if you remove the bark, you can see brown streaking that's found in the sapwood. So if you notice wilted branches and you cut that branch down and then you basically strip it, and you see that internal tissue and you see that streaking, then that's pretty much a surefire sign that this is the disease that you're seeing, unfortunately. So let's talk about that. So this is a fungus, And there's two types. There's two species of these closely related fungi. Okay. Um, One of them, the Novo Ulmi, is going to be more common and more aggressive. Also, more of an invasive species as well. And with this kind of fungus, it's in its scientific name, the ulmi, you're understanding that it's impacting specifically those elm diseases. I mean, those elm trees. It's specifically impacting those elm trees. Um, and so with that particular fungus, it is a problem. It is here now. It was brought over, of course, into the US, just like with many other types of pests and disease pathogens. And so it's left a lot of our tree species vulnerable. Now, how in the world does the fungus get on the tree? Well, we'll talk about that more here in a minute. But basically, we have bark beetles that are capable of carrying spores from tree to tree. Okay, so we're talking about an insect vector. So insects, unfortunately, can be vectors towards specific diseases. Could be fungal, could be viral, could be bacterial. So a lot of times too, we will talk about preventative or management. You got to take care of the insect before to help prevent the spread of the fungal disease. So basically, though, once these spores have made it onto the tree, and once they're inside the actual tissue itself, they can easily be carried up and down to the rest of the tree. Okay. So that's where it's carried up through the water conducting tissue, which makes it much easier, unfortunately, for it to infect the rest of the tree, and the spread can happen pretty quickly. This fungus produces a mycelium. It's thread-like in nature, and it is capable of growing downward towards the root system. And in fact, this is where it's even kind of even more crazy in a way, but it can spread through root grafts to infect neighboring trees. What do I mean by a root graft? Uh, with elm trees, it's possible for elm trees to form these grafts that allow water and nutrients to flow from one tree to the other. Okay. So there's like this interconnectedness between these trees that are allowing water and nutrients to cycle to each other. Okay. It's a whole network. And so, unfortunately, when you get this fungus into that network, not only is it impacting the tree it's already infecting, but now its spores, its fruiting bodies are going to go to the elm trees that are nearby. So, this is why it can be so destructive, is because of how, in a way, easily it can transfer from tree to tree. And once you get that infection through that root graft, through that root system, it's going to be quick. You're going to get downfall of that tree, decline of that tree pretty fast, unfortunately. So if you have, say, a whole grove of American elms and one elm is succumb to this disease, then unfortunately it's probably only a matter of time before the rest are. So again, that is why Dutch elm disease is incredibly destructive. So these are the little culprits that help to carry the fungal spores everywhere. Now, bark beetles are nothing new. We have both native types of bark beetles and non-native types of bark beetles. It doesn't matter, either the native or the non-native, both can spread the fungal spores. Again, they're just kind of doing their thing and feeding on trees. They can be considered a pest to a number of tree species and be kind of a problem child, if you will. Um, And so, especially for elms, if you see bark beetles on elms, then this is immediately an issue. So, what happens is the adult female beetles, they're going to lay eggs under the bark of the tree. And usually it's kind of a decaying part, a dying part, wherever they can kind of, if there's like, say, an open wound, say there's an open wound or bark's been removed or whatnot, that's where they're going to take advantage and they're going to lay their eggs. They've even been known to lay eggs on firewood as well. But the eggs are going to hatch. Then you're going to have the larva. The larvae are going to, just like any kind of other borer type insect, they're going to feed on the internal structure of the tree. They're going to feed on the inner bark and the inner sapwood, and they're going to tunnel through the tree. Okay. And if they so happen to have these spores around and the spores are on their bodies, well, guess what? As the larva is tunneling through the tree, so are the spores. The spores are traveling with the larva. So the spores are very sticky in nature, so they can easily stick inside those tunnels, get into the tissue, and then, as we've just talked about, easily transfer. So it's a problem. Not only is it a problem with the larvae tunneling through the trees, but once those larvae emerge from the trees as adults, they can still be carrying the spores. They can carry the spores on their bodies. And then at this point, they're mobile and they can fly to other trees to feed. So that's where you get both parts of their life cycle, where both the larva and the adult beetle itself can also transfer the fungus. So it's an issue. And what the adults typically do is they're going to chew through the bark and they can knock off the spores, which then leads to those infections. So again, it sounds like a complex life cycle, but it comes down to the beetles are carrying the spores and then the spores infect the tree, and that's how the tree succumbs to the disease. So this is all very doom and gloom, which a lot of this class is. Unfortunately, a lot of these classes are that way. But let's talk about, let's kind of go into next, how can we manage Dutch elm disease? So let's talk about that. So this is pretty extensive. So first of all, what you can do, especially if you have, say you have quite a few American elms in your woods, okay, and you want to protect them. Well, the first step is to try to prevent these trees from being desirable to the beetles, first of all. You don't want the beetles to want to go to your trees, okay? So how do you do that? How do you not let the beetles come to your trees? Well, for one, if you have any elm trees that are sickly already, maybe that are sick from decline of something else, and they're starting to die or decline, you will, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but you would remove those trees. Okay, and that reduces the number of breeding sites for the beetles to kind of take advantage. Okay, and if you happen to find elms on your property that already have the beetles there, you go ahead and take that proactive measure and you remove the tree to prevent them from eventually making their way to the healthy tree. So again, I know it's like sounds awful because it's like you're telling me that I still have to cut down these trees. Yes, but you're cutting down the sickly ones or the ones with beetle infestation to prevent the other trees from getting impacted. So, what if what if you do see evidence of the Dutch elm disease, the fungus already on your tree, like just specifically in the branches. You can remove the infected branches before it moves to the rest of the tree, but you're going to have to be, again, you're going to have to be scouting and searching this out. So as soon as you start to see problems with some branch dieback, you cut back the tissue, you see that streaking, you know it's the disease. Cut and remove all the infected branches, um, preferably at least 5 feet, 5 to 10 feet below the sign of the last streaking. You're going to cut it below that streaking, preferably pretty far away from it, just so then you know you're not cutting it down, but then there's still remnants of it left. You want to make sure you're getting the whole infected site out of there. Okay. So the next thing is pretty extensive, and I don't expect many people to really be doing this, but certainly, again, if you're a woodland owner and you have quite a bit of this, then this may be an option that somebody goes with. But say you have quite a few elms that are in close proximity, and this elm disease has spread through the root grafts. If possible, you can sever the root grafts with a vibratory plow before removing to prevent basically that fungus from then spreading to the rest of those trees. Um, so you can stop it. You can sever that graft first, um, to stop the infection from spreading to the other trees. But then eventually you're going to have to also then remove that infected tree as well. Here's some of the other things we talked about. Okay, are there resistant cultivars out there? Which I had mentioned one that was mildly resistant and then one that had some resistance. So you can choose whatever resistant cultivars are out there on the market right now for new plantings or to replace trees that have fallen to the disease. As this says, tolerant cultivars are not immune to the disease and may develop wilt if impacted. So like the Valley Forge, it may tolerate the disease, but it's not going to be completely resistant to it. Now, with that said, because it does have some immunity, then potentially it might get damaged, it might get harmed, but it may not die. Or it may not die as quickly. It might be able to tolerate that disease for a longer period of time instead of taking 2 years, maybe it takes 10 years or, something like that. Or even if it gets infected, if you can get it early, you can remove the infected plant material and then it would be fine. So, but basically, like if this is something where you want to bring back elms to your landscape, definitely recommend getting these more resistant cultivars. Now, when it comes to fungal diseases, there's always the question of spraying. Can I spray? Can I inject the tree? What can I do? Um, so the answer is yes, but more than likely you're not going to be doing this yourself. You're more than likely going to be hiring a certified arborist to do this. And in fact, with problems like emerald ash borer, for instance, it's very common for leave it to the forestry professionals to be the ones to be injecting the trees versus us. But also keep in mind that tree injections like this, they can be pretty expensive too. So you kind of have to weigh the cost as well. Also note with these fungicide injections, they may not always be effective when it comes to root grafts, like if they're spread through root grafts. Um, And generally too, with the fungicidal treatment, usually that needs to be repeated. This isn't a one and done treatment. You're going to have to do this every couple of years to keep the tree protected. Okay, so those are all things to think about. And again, not really something just like the general homeowner can do. More than likely, you're going to want to call somebody to handle that. And really something that I would say is going to be more in line with if you have a woodland full of these and you're trying to be proactive and you're trying to prevent them from being infected. So really for us, for the bulk of us here, the most we can do if we see issues of this disease is again with new plantings buying resistant cultivars. If we have American elms on our property, monitor them. If you have healthy American elms on your property that have not had this disease, first of all, that's fantastic, and let's hope it stays that way. But I will say monitor them closely. And from the county perspective, if you start to see some of the symptoms that we talked about today, if you start to see um, injury with the tree, or you see the presence of bark beetles and you're worried, could this have the disease? I mean, that's when absolutely you make a call to our office. I come out and look at the trees. I'll take samples, send it off to our diagnostic lab for analysis. If the diagnostic lab comes back and says it's this type of disease, then we'll kind of go from there on management practices. And again, a lot of those management practices could be, for example, if it is just infecting a branch or two, to prune out those infected branches. So but anyway, so that kind of is in a nutshell, kind of an explanation of this disease and some management options for it. Um, and so let me kind of close here. This is the general elm distribution, okay, across the US. And so the question arises, okay, where is Dutch elm disease? Well, wherever you see that green on that map, wherever there is elm, there is more than likely Dutch elm disease. Okay, so again, not trying to sound doom and gloom with that, but it's across the country, unfortunately. It can be found all over the place. This isn't something where it hasn't been found yet around here. It's already here. It's there, and we have to manage it and control it. So just like we're now having to manage things like other pests like emerald ash borer and things of that nature too. So anyway, just something to keep in mind. Um, this was a shorter talk, but one that I think is just good for you all to understand. Just because if you do have elm on your property and you see issues going on, then now that you're aware of it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and stop the class. I'm going to stop recording and then I will take questions.